Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com. Why are conductors afraid to play loudly? What is the issue these days? It's purely a modern phenomenon. That we can prove simply by reference to recordings. So many conductors these days and so many orchestras can achieve miracles of subtlety, of sensitivity, of fine shadings, of dynamic nuance. But then, when they have to let it rip, nothing. They fall apart. They sound terrible. In fact, the classic case of an orchestra that lost its ability to play loud was the Berlin Philharmonic under Claudio Abbado and later Simon Rattle. Why? What went wrong? They went to pieces. What happened with these people? It's really astonishing. And it's a fact. It's a demonstrable fact. Part of the reason this bothers me is because I'm a percussionist and sort of noise is my business, right? I like noise. I like loud. But it's not even a question of loud. It's a question of audible. I like audibility. I want all the things that I see in the score to be reasonably audible. And that doesn't mean they all have to be in balance all the time. Orchestration is seldom balanced, especially when things get loud. When things get loud, the loudest instruments sound the loudest. There's a surprise, right? And so why is it that there are conductors, some of whom believe that, well, if you can't hear the second flute, then everyone else should be quiet? You should never sacrifice a natural fortissimo in order to allow some instrument that would otherwise be inaudible to be heard. They're all contributing. And even if you don't hear them specifically, their contribution is part of the general pressure wave that the orchestra is generating. When I was a kid, when I was younger, we'd go to the symphony and we'd sit in a nice small hall. I was in Connecticut. Usually we were in New Haven. So we went to Woolsey Hall at Yale. I don't know how many of you have been there. It is a fabulous hall with a glorious organ in it, by the way. And I saw Saint-Saëns' organ symphony there. And it was the most astonishing thing I ever saw, because when the organ cut loose, you couldn't hear the orchestra at all. You saw people moving around and bows going, but all you heard was this enormous wall of sound coming at you. It was thrilling. But when they stopped, you could tell they weren't playing. They just weren't a distinctive, isolated sound quality within the overall welter of sound. But they sure as hell contributed to it, because when that finale theme came in with the yum, 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 crash, and the brass go da-da-da. Sure, you could tell something was happening underneath the organ that was overwhelming everything. It was absolutely fabulous, and it was the right sound, because there are moments when the composer is not so interested that you hear the second violin part. He just wants you to be blown away. And it's the blow-away factor that is missing in so many of today's performances. I'll give you another example. I just think it's sort of the great joke of my, that I often talk to people about. The finale of Bruckner's Fifth has a completely independent bassoon part at the moment that huge chorale erupts at the end. It's really an independent bassoon part. You can look at it in the score because everyone's doing a rhythmic canon on the rhythm. Bump, 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 ba-dum, bump. You know that thing? Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. that little motive. And it's happening at the distance of one beat throughout all four beats in the measure, but the third beat was missing something. So Bruckner gave it to the bassoons because he was obsessive compulsive, and someone had to do that other part. I am waiting for the conductor who permits us at the middle of that finale to hear the solo bassoon line. It's crazy what's going on these days. And I think that I sort of unwittingly for a moment there touched on part of the problem. Part of the problem is that conductors are such micromanagers these days that to let the orchestra go, to do what it does best, all by itself, because orchestras know how to play loud. You just leave them alone, and it all works out. You don't have to do anything. If that, for a conductor to give up control would be just too much to ask them, because they not only do they have to be in control at all times because it's their obsessive compulsive tendency to be in control, but also, especially in live concerts, they do not want to give the impression that they are not shaping the most overwhelming climax in the whole work. But the result of that is that it makes the whole orchestra sound inhibited. I mean, if the players have to watch the conductor at every moment, especially at the loudest parts, they're never going to give their full energy to the part that they're playing, because they're always worried that the conductor's going to do this, that they're going to play too loudly. I remember seeing a performance of Mahler's First with Michael Tilson Thomas and the San Francisco Symphony, and at the very end, the 7 horns are standing up. Everything's going crazy. It's all going nuts. Mahler makes the distinction between forte and double forte cymbal crashes. Now, at that level of intensity and volume is a small matter. It's a small distinction. What he really wants is that the big ones be the loudest ones, and the ones that aren't the loudest ones can be a little tiny bit less. Well, Tilson Thomas really had exaggerated those distinctions. I mean, the forte wasn't a forte, it was a mezzo forte. So, the whole orchestra's going, da, 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 And so the cymbal player goes, da, 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 and then wham! Well, the wham was good, but it sounded so hopelessly mannered and artificial that he couldn't maintain a competitive level of intensity with what the rest of the orchestra was doing. And Tilson Thomas was there going, terrible, absolutely terrible. The great conductors always knew when to let go. Even the ones who were not known for being kind to the percussion. And for example, George Szell, in his Mahler 4, at the climax of the first movement, there's a huge tam-tam part. It starts mezzo forte and builds from there to that first big climax, the dissonant climax, with the trumpet screaming out, yeah, da, 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 that thing. You don't even know there's a tam-tam there. It's just not there. It's simply not there. And it's not there in most performances. It really is. It's just a disgrace that you don't hear the tam-tam part. But Szell could go crazy in Beethoven. His Missa Solemnis is just, completely insane. His live Missa Solemnis. He could do it. He knew when to do it. Sometimes he didn't. I mean, everyone has it. He could be over-controlling. And that's what happens when he got over-controlling, was the fortes and fortissimos began to sound, anal retentive. They started to sound restricted and muffled because the orchestra was so nervous they just couldn't let go. It really is, I remember seeing Mahler 6 with Leonard Bernstein in the Vienna Philharmonic. Half the time he didn't conduct at all. He didn't need to. These big moments, the first movement when they're all marching along and he just puts his hands down and marches, or at these wonderful moments where he just put his hands down and listened to the orchestra and made us listen to the orchestra. He was never afraid, for someone who was supposed to be such a narcissist and an egomaniac, and maybe in his personal life he was, but when it came to his conducting, he was the most selfless human being that ever stood on the podium. He was the most collegial person, and he respected his players, and he let them play. Otto Klemperer, there's another one. Brahms first. Holy cow, the way that the opening comes crashing in, that granitic, powerful wall of sound. Yeah, Brahms only marks it forte. Klemperer doesn't play it triple forte, he doesn't play it fortissimo, but it's big and it has amplitude, and he's letting the orchestra do what the orchestra does, and they do it splendidly. It's what they're trained to do. No conductor alive, no conductor in the history of the universe can control the corporate sound of an orchestra of that many players playing at full tilt for any length of time. It's just not physically possible. At some point, there has to be a measure of trust. And if there isn't, then, I mean, look at Furtwängler. Furtwängler made his whole reputation letting the orchestra go. Sometimes it went in several directions at once. Sometimes it went completely to pieces. But my goodness, he knew where those climaxes were. And it's because nobody could follow his beat anyway. They always were tremendous. If anything, he went too far in the other direction. Everything was a climax, no matter when it came. But he understood. And in the German repertoire, the repertoire that's supposed to be so subtle and sophisticated, whatever, he was exciting. He let the orchestra be exciting. And that's why he has the reputation he does. If he had been the kind of micromanager that came later, he never would have had the reputation that he enjoys now. Karajan, who succeeded him also, Karajan could make a deafening sound with just a string section. I mean, one of the things that was so fabulous about the Karajan sound, people always talk about it being, thick and glutinous and cushy and all that stuff. Yeah, but it also had tremendous dynamics, incredible dynamic range. And so, there were conductors who enjoyed the kind of volume that an orchestra could make. Beecham, he was fabulous. He used to be like a baseball pitcher. When the cymbals came in, he would go, "Pah!" Like that. There's no excuse for conductors today not allowing the orchestra to play out. It is one of the most awful mannerisms that I think we confront regularly. I just reviewed, the Telemann recording of the Bruckner Fourth. I mean, that was a disgrace. Why was it a disgrace? Because the brass never played. They might as well have not been there. They could have been in another room. It was all 2 levels too low in the dynamic range, inexcusably, absolutely inexcusably. And we see it all the time because the conductor gets to draw attention to him or herself by never relinquishing control of the orchestra. And I think it's terrible. And it's even worse. It's even worse these days in today's, very large concert halls. Remember, concert halls the concert halls for which most of the romantic pieces were written were far, far smaller than these enormous capacity, multi-thousand seat extravaganzas. The Hanover Square Rooms for a Haydn symphony in London, where Haydn premiered them, I think they sat around, it had a capacity of about 800 people, which was quite large. But the orchestra was 60. I mean, could you imagine a 60-piece orchestra in a hall with only 800 people in it today? I mean, even our small chamber orchestra halls are considerably larger than that. And the orchestras are considerably smaller. If you do a classical symphony, when was the last time you saw a Haydn symphony done with a 60-piece orchestra? But the reason the great conductors, the Bernsteins and Joachim, and these guys were so great, and Klemperer, oh my goodness, at playing Haydn, was because they let large orchestras fill the hall with a large sound. And the music works fabulously that way. Even in Haydn's day, I mean, Pierre Baillot, who wrote, The Art of Playing the Violin, or whatever the heck that treatise was in 1830-ish, he was talking about doing middle period Haydn with huge violin sections. Haydn's Trauer Symphony, Morning, the slow movement. He said, sounds fabulous when you have a really large string section, 40 violins. And nobody thought anything of the fact that when you were in a big room, you needed a big orchestra. And sometimes you needed a big orchestra in a little room. Liszt, when he rehearsed his orchestra at Weimar, the orchestra was quite small. It was like 40 some odd players, I think, Liszt's orchestras. And he was his orchestra, and he was rehearsing Lohengrin, which he gave the premiere of, and his symphonic poems. They all got together in a room the size of, it was like your average living room that crammed 40 people in it. And it must have been a deafening din. Must have been unbelievable, but exciting. And that's what composers expected. They expected loud to be loud and soft to be soft. But we are very, very far away from that concept. The only people who I think actually understand the joy of being loud these days, and it's to their credit, is the period instrument people. Because That's part of the period thing, is to restore the full dynamic range of the music. Although I was very disappointed, it's very funny. There's a big difference between the period instrument sound live and on records. Now, in modern music, you go hear it live and it's too quiet. The hall is too big and the room is too quiet. It's too quiet. And in period instruments, it's even worse because they play in huge halls. They'll play in huge halls. I remember seeing Trevor Pinnock in the English concert doing Bach's big D minor harpsichord concerto, BWV 1052, I think is that one. And it's such an amazing piece. But it was at UC Berkeley. And they have a large, very dead sounding concert hall. And they didn't have a big harpsichord. They had a little harpsichord. So he did it with a little teeny harpsichord and single string parts. You can't imagine how ineffectual it sounded. But Bach, of course, performed it at Zimmerman's Coffee House. How many people you think were at Zimmerman's Coffee House, sitting right next to the harpsichord and the orchestra? It must have been overwhelming. Absolutely overwhelming. And I want to be overwhelmed. I really do. You appreciate all the subtleties and all the quiet chamber music-like effects even better if they're followed by amazing effects of orchestral volume and intensity. You've got to have both. And I'm going to now give you a little demonstration just to show you what I mean. You'll see, I think you'll hear exactly what I mean. I'm talking now, I have two recordings of Strauss's Macbeth. Now, Macbeth is the least popular of all the Strauss tone poems, the least familiar. I happen to think it's a terrific piece. But one of the reasons that it's, I believe, so generally neglected, it is the most violent piece of music he ever wrote. In many ways, it really is. And the climax of it is the Rite of Spring goes to Germany. or went to Germany before the Rite of Spring. It's really, really crazy, vicious, nasty, fabulous. And it has, of course, it has an amazing tam-tam part, which is why I'm bringing it up now, because this is also sort of a follow-up on some of the questions you asked after the Tinnitus Classics, Tam-Tam's Greatest Hits, and about my discussion of how you often don't even hear it, which is absurd. Well, this is the craziest tam-tam part Strauss ever wrote. You've got like 20 loud shots in a row with cymbals and bass drum and horns going whack. It's just crazy. And it should sound absolutely, totally out of control nuts. Well, normally you don't even know that the tam-tam is there or the bass drum half the time. It's just unbelievable. You can't believe people what are they thinking? I want to play you these two examples. Now, the first one, and this is not a bad performance, by the way, not by any stretch of the imagination, taken as a whole. But, how many of us, are really excited about the oboe solo 2 minutes in when the entire climax misfires? It's just not going to happen, right? We're only human. We expect the payoff when the composer indicates that's where it should be. So anyway, this one is with the SWR Symphony Orchestra Baden-Baden and Freiburg under François Xavier Roth. He of Les Siècles, doing period instrument pictures and exhibition. Ooh, did that suck? But, this isn't bad Strauss. It gets the job done, and it's on Hänssler Classic. Let's listen to the climax. Okay, you heard a tam-tam there, right? Sort of in the background, sort of going, and then it sort of disappears, then it sort of pops up again. That's sort of par for the course. That's basically what you get. You know there's a tam-tam there somewhere. You can't actually hear what it's doing. And but otherwise, everything else is there and it's okay. But now, let's listen to Nimi Yarvi with the Scottish National Orchestra doing exactly the same passage and playing exactly what Strauss wrote at the volume at which Strauss wrote it. Now, which performance would you prefer? I want to thank, first of all, Hänssler and Chandos for letting me use these samples now. It's so exciting. Maybe I can do these comparisons once in a while, which I think is really cool. You'll notice also that Rant's performance is a little bit quicker than Yarvi's. Sometimes that's a good thing. If you're not going to hear the tam-tam part, you might as well play it faster and rev up the excitement a little bit that way. But Yarvi, at a slower tempo, gives it weight and that crushing power that should leave you plastered against the back wall of the auditorium, gasping for air. That's what Strauss wanted. Why should we ever settle for anything less than that? Does it make any sense? I don't think so. I think we're entitled to get our money's worth in decibels as well as in sophistication and artistry and sensitivity and all of that frou-frou stuff that these people seem to be telling us they're going for. Part of it also, I have to say, is the sort of, classical music snob thing, that the music is supposed to be so delicate and sensitive and it's got a bunch of little old ladies sitting there. Let me tell you something about those little old ladies. They're scary. They can handle the volume. They like the volume. All of the most exciting people I've ever spoken to at concerts have been little old ladies who don't need to be coddled. Half of them are deaf anyway. You can't play it loud enough for them. I mean, I remember particularly how exciting it always was back in the old days of the Soviet Union when the Russian orchestras came on tour because they played loud. They had, basically two dynamics, excruciating and slightly less excruciating. And when they did their encores, oh my God, the encores, the big, pas de deux, whatever the hell it was from Swan Lake, and, the Lezginka from Khachaturian's Gaina Suite. I mean, and they would peel the paint off of the concert hall. It was so exciting. I mean, when Kurt Mazur did an encore, it was the slow movement of the Lobosgesang Symphony. I mean, what is the point of the encore? That's the kind of mentality that I think has proved so damaging to concert life and to sort of, our classical music culture. A lot of people are right when they say it's dull or when they say it's just snooty and effete and gutless. We need to put the guts back in. There should be lots and lots of guts, piles of steaming, bleeding guts at the climaxes of these pieces. I think one of the reasons that Mahler has become so popular is because he fills the hall. His orchestras are so large, they fit in modern concert halls, and you get the full dynamic range. Although God knows there are enough conductors who are doing their best to restrict the dynamic range of Mahler symphonies. Anyway, you get the point. And I hope that this has given you some things to think about, because it really, really needs to be driven home to these people that if they don't trust their orchestras, if they can't let go, if they are so narcissistic that they have no concept of what a real fortissimo is, and the orchestra itself can't play one anymore because they've become so inhibited and so nervous. It's really a shame. We're losing a major aspect of orchestral writing and these orchestral sounds, which just ought to be possibly the most thrilling noise that anything could ever make. I mean, there is nothing as magnificent as the corporate sonority of a symphony orchestra going at full bore. No prisoners, all the way. I want to go all the way. And I know you do too. So keep on listening, folks. Thanks for joining me. Take care.